The first charge came at the hour when the light lay flat and yellow across the ridge, and the ground still held the heat of the long day. The old male heard them before he saw them, the low, carrying coughs of strange males moving through the brush at the edge of his territory. He had been lying in the shade of a single acacia, his head resting on his forepaws, his breathing slow and even. Now he raised his head. The sound was not close, but it was moving closer, and it was not the sound of his own blood. Behind him, at the base of a rocky slope, the cubs were sleeping in a shallow scrape of dust, their ribs rising and falling in the even rhythm of the very young. They had no idea the air had changed. He rose without hurry. That is the first thing a watcher would note, the absence of haste. A younger male might have charged toward the sound, meeting the threat head-on with his full weight. This one stood, shook the dust from his mane, and walked a slow half-circle, positioning himself between the approaching voices and the rock face. He did not roar. Roaring draws attention, and there was no need to tell the intruders where he stood. They already knew. They had come for exactly this. What he did instead was quieter. He lowered his head, took a step forward, and placed his body squarely in the line between the strangers and the sleeping cubs. It was a small movement, almost casual, but it was the whole fight in miniature, and it happened before the first blow was ever struck. The rival males emerged from the brush at a walk, not a run. There were two of them, both younger, both carrying the scars of their own recent battles. They stopped at the edge of the open ground and studied him. A fight between lions rarely begins with violence. It begins with measurement, the weighing of size, the reading of posture, the calculation of whether the other will break and run. The old male stood his ground. He was not as large as he had been a few seasons earlier. The muscles along his shoulders had lost some of their density, and the fur at his elbows was thin with age. But he did not shift his weight. He did not glance back at the cubs. That, a field observer would note, was the detail that mattered most. The three of them held that stillness for a long stretch of time, longer than most watchers would guess. Heat shimmered off the dry ground between them. A single bird called from the acacia and then went quiet. The younger males exchanged a look. Then the larger of the two took a step forward, and the old male answered with a step of his own, and the distance between them closed by half. No sound had been made, no threat had been spoken, but the terms had been set. The old male would not be moved by presence alone, and the younger males now knew that the ground between them would have to be paid for in another currency. That is the moment this story really begins. Not with the first clash, but with the refusal that preceded it. The intruders had not come to negotiate. They had come to take what the old male spent years building, and the only thing standing between them and the rock face was a single animal who had decided, before any blood was drawn, that he would not step aside. It was a decision made without ceremony. He simply held his line and waited for them to make the next move, and they did. What followed was not one continuous battle, but a series of engagements, each one breaking apart and reforming like weather. The first rush came sudden and violent, the larger rival closing the distance in a handful of strides, launching himself at the old male's shoulder. The impact was audible, a heavy thud of bone and muscle meeting. Dust exploded around their legs. For a few moments they twisted and strained, jaws snapping at each other's necks, claws raking down flanks. The old male took the first blow without giving ground, a gash across his foreleg that began to seep immediately. But he did not fall, and he did not retreat. Instead, he braced, drove his shoulder into the younger male's chest and pushed. The rival stumbled back a step, more surprised than hurt. That was the pattern that would define the next many hours. The rivals would attack. The old male would absorb the attack and hold his ground. The rivals would break off, circle and regroup. It looked, to a casual eye, like a stalemate, but it was not. Every exchange cost the old male something. A tuft of mane torn loose, a new line of red across his hip, a little more weight in his breathing. The younger males were rotating, attacking one after the other, each one resting while the other worked. The old male had no such luxury. Every breath he took was taken while facing them. Every moment of stillness was a moment of vigilance. The fight was not a single event. It was a long, grinding refusal that stretched across the whole of the day. A day-long fight has its own architecture. What looked like a stalemate was, in fact, a slow expenditure. The old male paying in blood and breath while the younger ones rested and rotated. If you want to keep witnessing these long spans of behavior, where nothing settles quickly and every cost is exacted in full, subscribe to this channel, which holds only the record and no commentary. In the comments, leave a single word for what the old male was actually doing through those hours. Not a name for the fighting, but for the holding. The cubs had woken. That was the detail the old male could not afford to look at, but the watcher could see it from the ridge. Two small shapes had stirred at the base of the rock face, lifting their heads, blinking in the flat yellow light. They did not understand what was happening. They made small questioning sounds, the kind cubs make when they are hungry or confused. Behind them, higher up the slope, the lionesses had appeared. Two of them, motionless, watching the fight below. They were not joining. That was not their role in this moment. Their work would come later, if there was a later. For now they stood as still as the old male, their eyes fixed on the shifting knot of bodies on the open ground, waiting for a signal that had not yet come. The second engagement began the way the first did, with a rush, a collision, a tearing sound. This time the smaller rival came in low, aiming for the old male's legs, trying to take him off his feet. The old male saw it coming, shifted his weight, and met the charge with a downward snap of his jaws that caught the younger lion across the muzzle. There was a sharp yelp, almost a whimper. The younger male recoiled, blood suddenly bright on his nose. But the larger rival was already moving in from the side, and the old male had to turn to meet him, leaving his flank exposed for a split second. A claw caught him there, raking a long line down his ribs. He grunted, a low, forced sound, and spun to face the new threat. The smaller male recovered, shook his head, and rejoined the pressure. This was the arithmetic of the situation, and it was brutal in its simplicity. 2 against 1, rotating attackers against a single defender. The old male could not rest, could not turn his back, could not afford a single moment of inattention. Every time he committed his weight to one opponent, the other was already moving to exploit the gap. He was not fighting a battle. He was fighting a siege, and sieges are won by time, not by force. The question, the only question that mattered, was whether his body would hold out longer than the rival's patience, and the rivals knew it. That was why they kept circling, kept testing, kept forcing him to spend himself in small, constant payments of blood and breath. By the time the sun had begun its long slide toward the horizon, the old male was visibly laboring. His flanks heaved with each breath. His head hung a little lower between his shoulders. The dust clung to the wet patches on his coat, where the blood had dried and been reopened. He had taken more wounds than a casual count could keep, none of them fatal, all of them costly. The rivals, too, showed marks. The smaller one had a torn ear. The larger one favored his right foreleg. But they were younger, and they were two, and they could trade injuries at a rate the old male could not match. Still, he did not retreat. Still, he held his line between them and the rock face. The sun sank lower. The light turned from yellow to amber, to a deep, bruised orange. The cubs had stopped making sounds. They had crawled closer together at the base of the rock, their small bodies pressed against each other, their eyes wide and dark and fixed on the shapes moving on the open ground. The lionesses had moved, not down, but up, edging the cubs slowly, inch by inch, toward a narrow gap in the rock where the slope steepened. It was not an escape. Not yet. It was preparation, the quiet repositioning of the vulnerable, while the attention of the dangerous was held elsewhere. And that was exactly what the old male was buying with every step he refused to give. The rivals noticed the movement at the rock face. They did not have to be told what it meant. They had come for the cubs. That was the whole purpose of the invasion, the point of the long walk through the brush and the careful study of the old male's territory. Kill the cubs, and the bloodline dies. Kill the cubs, and the females will come back into season, and the territory will belong to new blood. The old male's long defense was not an act of aggression, it was an act of obstruction, and the rivals understood its purpose as clearly as he did. He was not trying to beat them. He was trying to outlast them, to hold the space until the cubs were somewhere they could not be reached. The larger rival made his decision. He broke off the circling and charged, not at the old male this time, but at the rock face, at the narrow gap where the cubs were being pushed. It was a sudden, explosive move, the first real attempt to bypass the defender entirely, and the old male answered it with a burst of speed that seemed impossible for a body so worn. He cut across the rival's path, launching himself into the younger lion's flank with his full remaining weight. The collision sent them both sprawling into the dust, a tangle of limbs and roars. The smaller rival moved to join, then stopped, uncertain, as the writhing shapes on the ground made it impossible to strike without hitting his own ally. For a few long heartbeats, the fight became a single violent knot. And then it broke apart again. The old male rising first, blood streaming from a fresh gash over his eye, the larger rival slower to his feet, shaking his head. The charge had failed. The old male had paid for its failure with more blood and more breath, but he had paid, and the cubs were still alive, still being pushed slowly, inch by inch, toward the gap in the rock. The rivals pulled back to the edge of the open ground and stood together, their sides heaving, their eyes on the old male. The light had gone from orange to a deep red, and the first long shadows were reaching across the dust. The fight had been going on for hours. The old male was still standing. He was still between them and the cubs, and he showed no sign, no flicker of intention of ever planning to stop. The smaller rival was the first to look away. It was a tiny thing, a drop of the head, a shift of weight onto the back foot. The larger rival saw it and made a low sound, a growl that was half command, half question. The smaller male did not move forward again. He stood where he was, breathing hard, his torn ear dark with dried blood, and he watched the old male with something that could not quite be called respect, but was no longer simple aggression. The larger rival turned back to face the old male, and for a long moment, the two of them simply looked at each other across the dimming ground. The old male did not blink. He did not lower his head. He simply stood and waited and held the line. The old male held that gaze without offering anything. No threat, no invitation, no sign of the cost his body was carrying. That stillness had become a language of its own. The rivals read it the way animals read all things, not with thought, but with the body's ancient reckoning. The longer they looked, the clearer the message became. Whatever they wanted from this ground, they would have to take it from a creature who had already decided that the price of taking it would exceed its worth. The smaller rival's weight shifted again, not forward, not quite away either. The old male did not blink, and in that unbroken stillness the encounter turned. Subscribe to keep receiving these records as they unfold. No narration, no urgency, only the animal's own timing. Comment the phrase, "the line," if you recognize the moment the smaller rival shifted his weight and gave the first ground. The next part of the record belongs to those who stayed to see how it settles. Then the larger rival made a sound that changed the texture of the whole encounter. It was not a roar and not a growl, but something intermediate. A low, rolling rumble that came from deep in the chest and faded into silence. He turned his head, looked once at the gap in the rock where the cubs had been, and then looked back at the old male. There was a long pause. Then he turned his body, deliberately, and began to walk back toward the brush. He did not hurry. He did not look over his shoulder. He simply walked, and after a hesitation that lasted only a few heartbeats, the smaller rival followed. The old male did not move. That was the crucial detail, the one a watcher would write down. The rivals walked away, and he stayed exactly where he was, in the line he had chosen hours earlier. His body was a ruin of small wounds, his breathing still labored, his head still low between his shoulders. But he did not follow them. He did not chase. He did not turn to check on the cubs yet either. He stood in the darkening light, watching the two shapes grow small and then disappear into the brush, and he held his position until the sound of their movement had faded completely. Then, and only then, did his head sink a little lower. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick with the sounds of a body that had been pushed to the edge of its capacity. The ragged draw of breath, the small involuntary grunt that came with each shift of weight, the wet sound of wounds still seeping. The dust around his feet was dark and clotted. He stood like that for a long time, not lying down, not moving, as if the act of staying upright had become the only thing he could still control. The light had gone from red to a gray dusk, and the first cool air of evening moved across the ground, carrying the smell of dry earth and blood. Then he turned, not quickly. There was nothing quick left in him, but with a slow, deliberate rotation of his whole body, the way an old animal moves when it knows it cannot afford a sudden motion. He looked up at the rock face. The gap was empty. The cubs were gone. The lionesses were gone with them, their shapes having melted into the higher ground sometime during the long standoff. He did not make a sound. He simply looked at the empty rock for a long moment, and then he began to climb. The slope was steep and loose, the kind of ground that demands care even from a healthy animal. His front legs took the weight, his hind legs pushed. Every step dislodged a small cascade of stones. He moved slowly, pausing often, his head hanging low. He did not follow the exact path the lionesses had taken. He followed the scent instead. The faint, familiar smell of his own blood and theirs laid down over the dust. A watcher high on the opposite ridge could have followed his progress by the small disturbances of stone and the occasional flash of his pale coat against the dark rock. He came to a shelf where the slope flattened. Here the scent was stronger, the signs of passage clearer. A tuft of gold fur caught on a sharp edge, a shallow depression where a small body had rested. He stopped at the tuft of fur and stood over it for a long moment, his breath still ragged. Then he lifted his head and looked up the slope. Above him, the terrain narrowed into a steep gully that led toward the higher ground, where the pride would make it stand. He could not see them, but he could feel the shape of the next decision forming in the worn machinery of his body. He had done what he set out to do. The threat was gone. The cubs were beyond its reach. Every hour of that long standoff had been spent for this, the purchase of a chance, the opening of a path that had not existed when the first charge came. By every measure that a watcher might apply, the fight was over and the defense had held. But the body does not read victories the way the mind does. The body reads cost, and the cost of this particular victory was still being tallied in every torn muscle and every thread of breath as he stood on the shelf and looked up at the gully. He did not lie down. He did not rest. He took a step, then another, and began the slow work of climbing the rest of the way. The gully was narrow enough that his shoulders brushed both walls at once, and the rocks were loose under his paws. Each step required a decision, a placement, a commitment of weight that his limbs were no longer eager to give. He stopped twice, head hanging, sides heaving. The second time, he stood so still for so long that a watcher might have wondered if he would move at all. Then he took another step. The climb was not fast. It did not need to be. The danger was gone, and the only clock that mattered now was the one inside his own body. He crested the top of the gully into a hollow sheltered by a ring of boulders. The air here was still. The ground was bare rock, swept clean by weather, holding no scent of the pride. They had moved on, higher, deeper, into the broken country where the terrain favored the hunted over the hunter. He stood at the edge of the hollow and looked out over the darkening slope, his breath still coming in long, slow drags. He had not caught up to them. He was not sure when he would. But the direction was clear, and the night was young, and he had a path to follow. The stars were coming out. The air had cooled to the point where the heat of his own body felt strange against it. He stood there for a long time, not moving, not making any sound, just breathing in the night air and letting the trembling in his legs slowly settle. Somewhere out in the darkness, beyond the reach of his eyes but not beyond the reach of his knowledge, the cubs were moving through the broken ground, following the lionesses into the deep country where the threat would not follow. He could not see them, he could not hear them, but he knew the direction. A sound came from the darkness, faint, far off, a single low call. It was not a challenge, and not a question. It was a marker, a way of saying here, in the language that old animals use when they have shared ground for too long to need words. The old male raised his head. He did not answer with a roar. He answered with a low, rumbling grunt, the kind of sound that carries just far enough and no farther. Then he began to walk, following the direction of the call, into the dark. He moved through the night at his own pace, unhurried, his body still carrying the weight of the day's work. The ground here was rough, cut by dry watercourses and scattered with boulders worn smooth by wind. He knew this country the way an animal knows the ground it has walked for years, not as a map, but as a memory of slopes and smells, and the particular way the light fell at different hours. Each step was placed with the care of a creature that cannot afford a misstep. The wounds had stopped seeping, but they had not stopped hurting, and every stride reminded him of the cost. The call came again, closer this time. He stopped and listened. It was not the cubs. Their voices were too high, too small to carry this far. It was one of the lionesses, her voice low and steady, telling him the way. He turned slightly, adjusted his course, and walked on. The night deepened around him. The stars wheeled slowly overhead. He did not look back at the ground he had defended. That part of the day was done, and the old male's body had already filed it away with all the other days of work, all the other prices paid without any accounting. He found them in a shallow depression between two ridges, where the ground was soft with drifted sand, and the walls rose high enough to block the wind. The lionesses were lying together at the base of the near wall, their bodies curled around the two small shapes that pressed against them. The cubs were asleep, deeply, completely, the way the very young sleep after a long day of fear they did not understand. The lionesses lifted their heads as he approached. They did not get up. They watched him cross the last stretch of open ground, noted the way he moved, the weight he favored, the new pattern of his breathing. They did not make a sound. He stopped at the edge of the depression. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the small family gathered against the rock, and then he lowered himself down, slowly, carefully, with a grunt of effort, onto the sand a short distance from them. He did not move closer. He did not push his way into the circle of warmth. He lay where he had stopped, his head resting on his forepaws, his eyes half closed, his breath still coming in long, slow drags that lifted his ribs and let them fall again. The sand was cool beneath him. The wind moved across the depression and did not touch him. He lay there, not quite sleeping, not quite awake, his body slowly beginning the long work of repair that would take many days and leave its marks regardless. The cubs did not wake. The lionesses did not move. The night held all of them in the same stillness, the same slow breathing, the same silence that settled over the broken ground after a day of violence. The old male did not close the distance. He lay at the edge of the warmth, and the night did not ask him to move. Subscribe if you want to keep witnessing these quiet returns where survival is measured in the space between bodies. Leave the word edge in the comments if you saw that distance as part of the record, not as rejection. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, one of the cubs stirred. It lifted its head, made a small questioning sound, and looked around in the dark. Its eyes found the shape of the old male lying apart from the group. It looked at him for a long moment, a small, dark-eyed study of the worn body on the sand. Then it lowered its head back down against the lioness's flank and went back to sleep. The old male did not open his eyes, but his breathing changed, a small adjustment, a slight deepening, as if something in him had registered the look and the sleeping and the safety that the look implied. He lay still. The night moved on. The stars wheeled toward the first gray hint of dawn, and the sand began to cool toward the hour when the light would return and the waking would begin. When the light came, it came slowly, a gradual brightening of the eastern sky that turned the sand from gray to pale gold. The old male was the first to rise. He did it in stages, lifting his head, then his chest, then pushing himself up onto his forelegs before gathering the strength to stand. He stood for a moment, swaying slightly, his head low. Then he walked, stiffly, to the edge of the depression and stood looking out over the country that lay below. The cubs woke. They stretched, yawned, made the small sounds of the young beginning a day. They did not approach him. They did not need to. They knew where he was. They had always known, in the way that very young animals know the shape of the one that guards the edge of things. One of them looked up at him, standing against the pale sky, and then turned its attention to the business of being young. The nuzzling, the pushing, the small, urgent demands of hunger. The old male did not turn around. He stood at the edge of the depression, looking out over the country, his body still carrying the marks of the day before. He was thinner than he had been. The wounds were dark against his coat, but he stood without shifting his weight, and he looked out over the ground that was still his, and he did not move. The sun climbed, and the shadow of the ridge pulled back across the sand. The old male remained at the edge of the depression, not patrolling, not hunting, just present. The lionesses took the cubs a short way off, into the shade of a boulder, and the sounds of the morning, the scrape of paws, the low murmur of the females, the occasional high note of a cub, settled into the ordinary rhythm of a pride beginning another day. He did not join them. He stayed where the ground was open, where the view ran clear to the brush line and the rocks. A watcher would have noted that he did not look at the cubs. He did not need to look. The work of guarding is not done with the eyes alone, but with the whole body, with the simple fact of being in the place where the threat would have to pass. He stood there as the day warmed, as the heat built off the sand, as the flies found the wounds, and he did nothing to drive them off. The hours passed. The light moved across the depression. The cubs slept, woke, played briefly in the shade, and slept again. The lionesses took turns watching the sky and the slopes, and the old male stayed at the edge, patient, unhurried, a fixed shape against the pale gold of the ground. Nothing came. The brush line stayed empty. The only movement was the heat shimmer and the slow drift of a bird across the high sky. He did not test his wounds. He did not try to run, or leap, or reach the speed a younger animal would have taken for granted. He stood, and he watched, and he waited. That is the quiet arithmetic of an old defender. The territory is not held by force but by presence, by the sheer refusal to be anywhere else. He had given the whole of the previous day to that refusal. He would give this day too, and the next if it came to that, because there is no other accounting for a father who has chosen to stand. The afternoon passed into the long amber of evening. The cubs, fed and drowsy, pressed together at the base of the boulder. The lionesses lay close, their heads raised, their ears turning slowly. The old male had not moved from his post. His head was low, his eyes half closed against the glare, but he was awake and he was there, and the brush line remained empty. As the light failed and the first stars appeared, he finally turned. He walked the short distance back into the depression, his stride still stiff, his body still carrying the marks of the day before. He did not lie down with the others. He lay down at the edge of the circle, a little apart, his head resting on his forepaws, his eyes open in the gathering dark. The cubs slept. The lionesses slept. The territory held, and the old male lay awake at the edge of them all, listening to the night, keeping the last watch that no one would ever record and no one would ever thank. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the country opened out into the deep dark, and the air carried nothing but the sound of wind over stone. He had bought the chance. They had taken it, and the night, for now, belonged to him.